Alright, in this demo I'm going to show you how to sew a combined neckline armhole facing. So we have 4 different pattern pieces here. We have a center back facing, we have our center back bodice, and we have our center front facing and our center front or front bodice. Okay, the facings, as you can see, they're combined neckline and armhole facings, meaning they're not separated. I don't have just an armhole facing and a neckline facing. They're all in one. Okay, so for the fronts, we've cut 1 layer on fold. Okay, so we've cut both these on fold, and then in the back we've cut 2. All right, so 2 of the facing and 2 of the back. All right, so let's go ahead and start getting these ready to stitch together. I'll remove the pattern pieces. Those out of the way. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do on all of these is we're going to stay stitch our armholes. Okay, so here's the armhole of the facing, armhole of the bodice, neckline of facing, neckline of bodice, and same thing on the front, neckline and armhole of bodice and the front. Okay, so let's go ahead and stay stitch all those. Okay, we're at the machine. I'm going to go ahead and just stay stitch these as quickly as possible. Again, I'm stay stitching my neckline and armholes, and I'm doing it at the exact seam allowance, which is a 1/2 inch. Again, one of the reasons we stay stitch is when things are on curves, when we've cut things out on curves, we don't want those to stretch because they are cut through the bias of the fabric, and that can stretch easily when you're sewing on it. So we don't want that to happen. Also, in the case of this garment, we'll also be doing some clipping, so things, once they're sewn together, lay nice and flat. So it's always nice, if you know you're going to clip a seam, it's nice to stay stitch it, so that when you clip it, those cuts don't continue on, or if you have to end up taking that seam out, you'll have the stay stitching there and you'll know exactly where your seam is. Okay. Again, we're just stay stitching all our necklines and armholes on both the facing pieces and on the bodice pieces. So we're doing that as quick as possible. Okay, so we've stay stitched all our neckline and armholes. Let's go back to our table. Alright, we're back. So let's lay out our pieces. There's our back facing, our other back facing, back bodice, and front bodice, front facing right here, put this down here, and our other back facing. Okay, so what we're going to do now is sew the side seams of our bodice together and our facing together. Okay, so we're going to put right sides together and match up our side seams on our bodice. And let's just throw a couple pins in there so we keep everything together and organized where it's supposed to be. And this side too. There we are. that aside for 1 second. And on our facings, we're going to do the same thing. So there's our front facing, and we'll line up the side seams of our front facings together. And we'll just pin these together to hold them in place. Alright. So now we're going to go and stitch the side seams of our facings and our bodice together. One more thing we're going to do while we're there, and we're only going to do this on the facings layer, is we are going to stay stitch all the shoulder seams of just our facings, okay? Not the bodice, just the facings. And we're going to stay stitch them at a 1/2 inch, all right? Later, when this is almost all done, to close up everything, we'll need to do some hand tacking, and this will be a great way to figure out where to match up the two shoulder seams to close them up, okay? So let's go ahead and stay stitch our shoulder seams of our facings, and then the side seams of our facings and our bodice. We'll go back to the machine and do that. Alright, here we are at the machine again. I'm going to go ahead and stay stitch the shoulders of my facings first. So back and front shoulders, stay stitch of the facings at the seam allowance, which is a 1/2 inch. So we'll quickly do that. There we go. So now all my shoulders of my facings have been stay stitched at a 1/2 inch. Go ahead and clip these threads. And now we'll do our side seams. Okay, side seams are going to stitch together at a 1/2 inch. That's where our seam allowance is on these particular patterns. Back tack at the beginning and end, because this is a permanent stitch. And I'm sewing the side seams of my facings right now. Go. So that's the facings. Okay, put those aside for now. And now we'll do the side seams of our outside bodice. And again, those are a 1/2 inch as well. Stitch them together. Back tacking beginning and end. 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, let's go back and press these at the ironing board. Okay, so here we are. We've stitched the side seams of our bodice closed, and we've stitched the side seams of our facings closed as well, and we stay stitched all the shoulder lines of our facings. Okay, so let's go ahead and press all the side seams open. Let's do it over this ham. Alright. So that's our facings have now been, the side seams have been pressed open on the facings. And we'll do the bodice now as well. There we go. Okay, so let's lay out our bodice right side up, like so. Okay, now we're going to take our facings, and if you look, this is the center front of my bodice, okay? Armhole, armhole, center backs are out here. We're going to take the center front of our facing and put right sides together, lining up both center fronts. And we'll go ahead and line up our armholes. So that everything is now lined up. Okay, side seams, shoulders, armholes, and center back. Necklines, want that all lined up. Okay, and these are cut from the same pattern, so they shouldn't have any issue lining up. Okay, I'm going to start by pinning out. I'm going to start the center and pin out in each direction. Here's center front at neckline. Let's go ahead and put that together. Okay, and then pin out in each direction. Okay, this neckline. And then at armhole, we're going to do the same thing. I like to pin right at intersection of side seam, where the two front and back come together, and then pin out in each direction, like so. Just make sure all the cut edges are lined up. Your notches are matching. Okay. And back neckline as well. Okay. Here's my center back notch right there. Now, depending if you've already put the closure in or not, you may not want to start pinning right there. There's different ways to do this. I usually pin an inch away, depending on what my seam allowance is. And that's where I'll start stitching and stuff. It makes it easy to finish all this off if you were to put some kind of closure at center back in this, if you had not already done it. Okay. Okay. And do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so armhole and back neckline. No difference, just start at the center, pin out in both directions. Okay, everything has been pinned together now. Necklines, armholes, and necklines. Let's go to the machine, and what we're going to do is go ahead and just stitch these together. We're going to stitch our back neckline, our armhole, our front neckline, other armhole, and then our other back neckline. The one thing we're going to do is when we stitch these together, we'll stitch our neckline, our armhole, whatever we're doing, and when we get close to the shoulder, we're going to stop like 1 or 2 stitches away from where our stay stitching is. It will just make it easier when this is all done to get in there and clean everything up. Okay? Alright, so let's go ahead and go to the ironing board, or go to the sewing machine and stitch this. Alright, we're back at the machine. Let's go ahead and start stitching this. I'm going to start at this back neckline right here. And again, depending if you put your closure in or not yet, might dictate where you're going to sew here. You need room to put the closure in. So I would start like stitching about an inch away from center back or something like that. Again, for this demo, that's not so much important. It's more about learning how to do this kind of facing. Okay, so let's go ahead and stitch our back neckline. And this is a permanent stitch. So we're back tacking the end. And then here's my shoulder line right here. I can see my stay stitching through. Okay, there. I'm going to stop just like a stitch or two before that stay stitching and back tack. There we go. Okay, so one back neckline is done. Let's do our other one. Okay, so I'm starting at the shoulder. Here's another one. And it doesn't really matter what order you go in. You could do neckline, armhole, neckline. It doesn't matter how you stitch it, as long as they all get stitched right now. Okay, now I'm going to do my armholes. And these are very easy to stitch together because you're just stitching like seam to like seam. Be careful when you stitch over seams that are open that you don't stitch over them and fold them to one side. You want them to stay open. You want a garment to lay. You don't want the garment to get bulky or not lay flat when it's all done. Okay. And now we're going to do our front neckline. Okay, front neckline is done. And now for our last armhole. There we go. So let's go ahead, clip that as threads, and we'll go back to the cutting table. Alright, we've gone and we've stitched this together at our necklines and armholes. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to clip through the curves of our neckline and armholes. That way, when we fold this right side out, it will give us a seam that curves correctly. Right now, this is inside out, and the seam allowance is actually going the opposite way it will when we fold it right side out. Okay, we'll be kind of flipping the seam the other way. And so what it will need to do is be able to pull away from itself at these curves. So we want to clip right down to our stitching line through these curves, which allows it to do that. And so when it's done, it gives us a nice clean curve. Okay, we don't need to go through the straighter parts of the garment, just through the curved. Okay. And I'm clipping about, I don't know, inch, 5/8. Depends on how deep of a curve it is. The steeper it is, kind of the more clipping you'll need. Like this front neckline needs a little bit more. Whereas the armhole is not quite as dramatic as that one, so don't need quite as much. Okay. Okay, there we go. Everything's been clipped. Now, if you're new to sewing, it'll make it easier. You can go and press all these seams open. Okay, you'll have to do it over a ham. It'll make it much easier. Okay, if you feel a little more confident, next step we're going to do is we're going to do something called understitching. Okay, so here is my facing. Here's my garment. Understitching, what we're going to do is on the facing, okay, the facing side, we're going to stitch very close to the seam, about a 1/16 of an inch away. We're basically top stitching through the facing, a 1/16 of an inch away from the seam that we just stitched, okay? When we do that, we go down through the facing and we catch all the layers of seam allowance as well. We have 2 layers of seam allowance. We have the layer from our bodice and the layer from our facing. We want those seam allowances to all be going towards the facing, okay? So when we stitch, we'll be understitching. We're going to stitch through our facing layer, top stitch through our facing layer, about a 1/16 of an inch away from the seam, and we're going to be catching both layers of seam allowances. We don't want any seam allowance going towards the garment side. It all needs to be going towards the facing side. This is a technique that gives you a nice finish once you're all done, because what happens is the facing presses back and it pulls about a 1/16 of an inch of that fashion fabric back with it and gives you a nice clean edge on the front. Okay, so let's go to the machine and do some. We're going to understitch all our armholes, necklines, everything that we just stitched. Here we go. So I'm going to go ahead, understitch now. This is my back neckline. This is my facing here. This is the bodice on this side. I'm going to stitch nice and close, about 1/16 of an inch away from my seam. I'm pulling the facing towards the right and the bodice towards the left because I want to make sure I have a nice crisp seam here. I don't want anything folding over or pleating. And I'm making sure all my seam allowance is going towards my facing. We're going to back tack at the beginning and end. And this can be difficult because you have lots of layers of fabric. Things are sewn on a curve. And so you gotta kind of sew and readjust, sew and readjust. And you have these kind of 2 garments that are sewn together, and they want to pull in different directions, and they can easily fold underneath themselves. And you can stitch them by accident where they shouldn't be stitched, so you gotta watch all that. Okay, so there's one back neckline done. Let's clip those threads. Let's do our armhole next. Okay, so it's going to be a little difficult. So basically here is my back neckline leading up to my shoulder seam, which is open right here. I'm going to shove all that under my foot to get to, okay, again, this opening is my shoulder. Starting here at the stay stitching, that's my armhole. So that's where we want to start stitching, at the intersection of armhole and shoulder on the facing side. And that's where we'll understitch. Make sure all the seam allowance is going towards the facing. Since we've clipped, we have to check that every now and then and make sure it doesn't flip back towards the garment. Okay, so I'll flip it up and look underneath every so often and keep stitching. Sometimes, depending on how thick or thin your fabric is, you can see through your fabric if it's there. But usually it's best to always just stitch for a little bit and then double check and then stitch a little bit more. We're coming up to the curve, the arm well. Okay, the armhole well. This is where that seam allowance can really flip back. Actually, I can see a place where I can clip a little better here to give me a better curve. There we go. And because this is curved fabric, see, it kind of want bunches up here. You gotta like flatten it out, stitch it 1.5 to 1 inch, flatten it out some more, stitch a little bit more. All right, and again, we're going around this armhole, making sure that seam allowance is all going towards my facing. Spreading it out, smoothing it out, making sure that my garment isn't pleating underneath or folding over on itself. And I'm coming up to my stay stitching. I'm going to go ahead and back tack this up there. Pull that out, cut these threads, and go on to the next, which is my front neckline. Again, this is curved and everything is wanting to go every other direction than you want it to go. So you just really got to fold it out, make it work for you, force it into the direction you want. There we go. And here we are at the front neckline now. I'm starting at the shoulder, intersection of shoulder and front neckline. We'll stay stitching. Make sure that interface or that seam allowance is all going towards your facing. Again, when it's curved, it flips back the other way sometimes. You want to make sure you're catching it all. Because this is kind of a steep curve, I'm checking it a lot because that seam allowance will really flip back the other way. It's going to fight me. I really have to kind of spread and flatten out that inch ahead of me, ahead of my foot, ahead of my needle, like so. And then keep moving back and flattening out the next part, checking to make sure that seam allowance is going in the correct direction, and then flatten the next part. Okay, there we go. It's done. Let's clip those threads. And we're going to the back, the other armhole now. Slide this under. Okay, let's go to the ironing board and press this. Okay, so here we are. We're going to press this, and let's start at our back neckline. This is the facing side, as you can see. Okay, and there's my understitching, and what that did is it pulls back that 1/16 of an inch and allows me to press it very easily and nicely to the back side. Okay, and on the front it gives me a nice crisp, clean curve. Okay, so again, understitching, you could do this without understitching it, but understitching just makes it so much nicer and cleaner. Okay, and I don't know if you can see through the muslin here, but you can actually see where I've clipped, how the seam allowance is pulling away from itself, and that also helps us give that nice clean curve in the end. Smooth, clean curve. All right, and because I understitched this, it makes it much easier to fold back and press. It almost falls right into place. I just have to smooth it out a little bit, and then I can just give it a good press. There's armhole, now we're at neckline. front neckline. And another armhole. There we go. All right, so there is the inside. If I flip it around here, it's the right side. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead. We're very close to being done now. Got a couple more steps. First thing I'm going to do is put right sides together again. So let's open this up. Like so. Okay. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take and fold back this facing layer. Okay. And we're going to grab the two outside bodice layers and pin those together. Okay, so we're folding back the the facing layer seam allowance on both sides here of the shoulder, and I'm just going to pin together the shoulder seams of the outer bodice. Okay. Definitely want to pin these together because it'll make it much easier to stitch them because you have these two layers you're folding out of the way. And do it on the other side too. So I'm bringing the edges together of the shoulder seam of just the bodice side of the shoulder seam and folding back the facing side of the shoulder seam. There we go. Okay. So all that's folded out of the way. Now we're going to go to the machine and we're going to stitch the bodice shoulder seam together on both of these shoulders. Let's go ahead and do that. All right, we're at the machine. Let's go ahead, and again, I'm just folding away the facing side shoulder seam, getting that out of my way so that I can stitch the bodice shoulder seam. 1/2-inch seam allowance. Be careful not to catch the facing seam allowance in there. Make sure it's folded out of the way very well. Okay. And back tack beginning and end. Again, make sure it's not getting caught underneath the foot, the needle or anything, and getting stitched in. I'm talking about the facing side shoulder seam. I'm only stitching together the bodice shoulder seam right now. Alright, so there's one. That's what it looks like now. Okay, so I've just stitched together the bodice shoulder seam, and then here's my facing shoulder seam stitched. Do the same thing on the other shoulder. Again, make sure that the seam allowance of the facing is folded out of the way. One thing I forgot to mention is typically there would be interfacing inside the facing. Just something to remember when you're actually making a garment. Okay, there we go. Stitch together now. Okay. So there, that one is sewn together now as well. All right, let's go back to the ironing board. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take this. Here's our shoulder seam. So here's our facing shoulder seam. We're going to go ahead and press open the bodice shoulder seam first, like so. Just want to press that one seam. Try not to press the facing one. Okay, so I've pressed that open now. Now I'm going to take my back neckline facing. Okay, I'm going to lay that flat over, like so, and I'll just press it kind of into place. And we'll take our front neckline shoulder, and right on our stay stitching, we're going to fold under our seam allowance, like so, and line up that stay stitching as best we can. And just press it as we go. Press that seam allowance right under. And when you're done, if you have stay stitching that's showing, typically you'd be using thread that matches your fabric, but if it's showing, you can always pick that stay stitching out there. Okay, there we go. And now what I'll do is I'll just pin this in place, and we're going to go back and hand tack that with a hidden slip stitch. Okay, let's go ahead and do the other shoulder real quick. So again, fold facing seam allowance out of the way. Take that shoulder seam allowance that's of the bodice, and press that open. I'm going to bring my back seam allowance right over on top of that and press it top. And then take my front facing shoulder seam allowance, fold that under. And give it a press. And then I'll just pin it. Okay, again, I'm matching up my stay stitching on my facing shoulder lines with each other. There we go. And now we're ready to hand sew it closed. Okay, so I have my needle and thread. I'm going to go and hand tack this closed. I'm going to travel through the crease of the shoulders that I pressed under. I'm going to catch a little bit of the opposite shoulder seam and then go back up through that crease, travel through the crease. Okay, so this is a hidden slip stitch. Go. It's important to travel through the crease because what it does is that thread, when it goes from stitch to stitch through the crease, it holds that crease, the fabric in between stitches down close to the body of the garment. Okay. go. And we'll just tie off. Create a loop, go through twice. There we go. Nice, clean, and finished. Alright, we'll just do this side very quickly. Okay. So there they are. This is the inside facing layer, all closed up. Okay, and then we fold it right side out. There's the right side shoulders. Okay, and this is what it looks like on the inside. And then the outside. So there we've done a combined facing, neckline, armhole combined facing. All closed up and clean finished.